History often remembers the men who owned the land, but forgets the ones who bled for it. This is a story about what happens when truth is buried, names are erased, and dignity is treated like it doesn't matter. But what if one voice refuses to be forgotten? What if one person decides that existence itself is something worth fighting for? Listen closely, because this story may change the way you see justice forever.
The Kansas wind didn't blow. It scraped. It scraped against the clapboard siding. It scraped across the dry, red dirt. And it scraped at a person's resolve, day in and day out, until there was nothing left but bone and grit. Josephine Wright had plenty of grit. She had to. It was 5 in the morning. The sun was just a gray promise on the eastern horizon. Jo was already on her knees in the dirt. She wore a faded canvas skirt and a man's work shirt. Her hands were caked in mud. She was checking the seals on the clay pipes she'd laid last spring. She hadn't hired a crew to lay those pipes. She didn't have the money. She dug the trenches herself, baked the clay herself, fitted the joints with pine pitch and prayer. Now the water flowed. From the creek, up the slight incline, straight into her 3 acres of winter wheat. Samuel had brought her here in 1869. They had stepped off the Kansas Pacific train with 2 trunks, a lot of hope, and a deed to 120 acres of nothing. Samuel had a strong back. Jo had a head for numbers. Together, they were going to build an empire. Then came the cholera of 73. It took Samuel in 4 days. It took the neighbor's boy. It took a dozen others. When the graves were dug and the dirt was patted down, the town of Oakhaven waited for the widow Wright to pack her bags. They expected her to get back on the train, head east, go back to Boston, where the air was soft and the women wore silk. She didn't. She stayed. She learned the soil. She learned the seasons. She figured out that if you rotated the beans with the corn, the dirt didn't die. She mapped the underground water reserves by watching where the wild grass stayed green longest in August. She built a life out of the dust. But Oakhaven didn't like a woman who didn't need them. Jo stood up. She wiped her hands on an old rag. Her joints ached. 38 wasn't old, but the West aged you double. She walked back to the farmhouse. The kitchen was warm. The iron stove was already hot. On the scrubbed pine table sat a letter. It had arrived yesterday. It was from Edmund Hale, the only lawyer in town. Jo poured a cup of black coffee. She didn't need to read the letter again. The words were already burned into her mind. Dear Mrs. Wright, it is my unfortunate duty to inform you that Silas Thorne has filed a petition with the county clerk. He is claiming the Wright farm as abandoned property. Abandoned. Because Samuel died without a will. Because in the eyes of the law, a woman wasn't a farmer. She was just a squatter on her dead husband's land. Silas Thorne was the town banker. He was on the town council. He wanted the land, and he was simply erasing her to get it. Jo took a sip of her coffee. It was bitter. She liked it that way. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of water. She just felt a cold, hard anger settle in her chest. A timid knock at the back door broke the silence. Come in, Mary, Jo called out. The door creaked open. Mary O'Brien slipped inside. She was 14, all elbows and knees, with fiery red hair and eyes that were usually bright. Today they were red and swollen. Mary's family had come from Ireland 2 years ago. They lived in a shack on the edge of town. Her father laid track for the railroad. The public school in Oakhaven didn't welcome Irish kids, said they were dirty, said they slowed the others down. So Jo taught her, every morning at 6, reading, writing, and mathematics. But this morning, Mary wasn't holding her slate. She was holding her torn apron. There was mud on her cheek. Mary, what happened? Jo set her cup down. Mary sniffled. She looked at her worn boots. It was the Miller boys, on my way here. They threw dirt clods at me. Jo's jaw tightened. Did they hurt you? Just my dress. Mary wiped her nose with the back of her hand. A fresh tear spilled over. They called me a dirty immigrant. They said my kind are ruining the town. They said I'm nothing but gutter trash and I don't belong here. Mary started to sob, her thin shoulders shaking. Maybe they're right, Mrs. Wright. Maybe we shouldn't have come. Joe walked over. She took the torn apron from Mary's hands and tossed it on a chair. Then she took Mary by the shoulders, firmly. "Look at me," Joe said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an anvil. Mary looked up, her blue eyes swimming in tears. "Listen to me, Mary," Joe stated, her tone deliberate and clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "No civilized society is allowed to build its wealth on the backs of immigrants and then strip them of their humanity. Your father built the railroad that brings their food. Your mother washes the clothes they wear to church. Your worth isn't determined by where you came from. It is determined by your mind and these two hands." Joe let the words hang in the quiet kitchen. She needed the girl to hear it, really hear it. "Equality isn't something people hand out of the goodness of their hearts," Joe continued, speaking each word with absolute precision. "It is something you have to learn to fiercely protect. You are a human being. You have the exact same right to walk down that street as the mayor himself. Do you understand me?" Mary sniffled again, but she stood a little taller. The trembling stopped. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Joe grabbed a damp cloth and gently wiped the mud from the girl's cheek. "Now, go wash your hands at the pump. We are starting fractions today, and no boy with dirt in his hands is going to stop you from putting numbers in your head." Mary managed a small, watery smile. She turned and headed back out the door to the water pump. Joe watched her go. The fierce protectiveness she felt for the girl mixed with the cold anger she felt towards Silas Thorne. It was the same fight. Different faces, but the exact same fight. Before Joe could turn back to her coffee, another figure hurried up the front path. It was Martha Higgins, her nearest neighbor. Martha was a good woman, but a nervous one. She always looked like a bird expecting a cat. Martha didn't bother knocking. She pushed the front door open, out of breath. "Joe, you need to hear this," Martha gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Morning, Martha. Put the kettle on." "No time for tea, Joe." Martha stepped into the kitchen. Her eyes were wide. "He's here." Joe frowned. "Who?" "The nephew. Nathaniel Hayes's nephew. From St. Louis." Martha leaned in, lowering her voice as if the walls were listening. "His name is Gideon Hayes. He came in on the late train last night to take over the Hayes Ranch." Joe felt a shift in the air. The Hayes Ranch bordered her property to the east. They shared a creek. They shared a property line. Whoever ran that ranch had the power to make her life very easy or completely impossible. "All right," Joe said slowly. "A new neighbor. That's to be expected." "Joe, you aren't listening." Martha grabbed Joe's arm. Her grip was tight. "Silas Thorne was waiting for him at the station. Silas took him straight to the hotel, bought him a steak dinner. They sat in the corner booth for 2 hours. Joe went perfectly still. "Silas has his ear, Joe," Martha whispered. "The man hasn't been in town 12 hours, and Silas is already drawing the map for him. You know what he's telling him about you. You know what he's telling him about your land." Joe looked out the window, across the red dirt, across the wheat she had planted with her own 2 hands. The storm wasn't just coming anymore. It was here. And it wore the face of a man from St. Louis who didn't know the first thing about the truth. "Let him talk," Joe said quietly. She picked up her coffee cup. Maps drawn by liars usually lead men right off a cliff. Gideon Hayes liked things that made sense. He liked mathematics. He liked load-bearing beams. He liked the solid, predictable weight of iron and steel. He was an engineer by trade, a man who built bridges in St. Louis and trusted the numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't carry grudges. Small towns, however, were an entirely different equation. He sat in the corner booth of the Oak Haven Hotel dining room. The leather was cracked. The air smelled of stale tobacco and fried onions. Across from him sat Silas Thorne. Silas was a man who looked like he owned the air he breathed. He wore a tailored suit that didn't belong in the dust of Kansas. He had a smooth voice, too smooth. "It's a tragedy, really," Silas said. He poured a measure of amber bourbon into Gideon's glass. "Your Uncle Nathaniel built this town. He wanted the Hayes Ranch to be the crown jewel of the county. And it will be, Gideon, now that you're here." Gideon took a slow sip. The whiskey burned, hot and cheap. "My uncle's letters mentioned a land dispute on the western boundary." Silas sighed. It was a practiced sigh, heavy, full of manufactured pity. "The Wright property," Silas murmured, shaking his head. 120 acres of prime grazing land. Samuel Wright claimed it back in '69. Good man, hard worker. But the cholera took him in '73. "And the widow?" Gideon asked. "Josephine." Silas tapped his cigar against an ashtray. "A sad case. Grief does terrible things to a woman's mind, Gideon. She's alone out there. She refuses to leave. She thinks she can run a working farm all by herself. It's delusional." Gideon frowned. "Is she starving?" "She's scraping by," Silas lied smoothly. "But the fact remains, Samuel left no will. The land is legally abandoned. The town council, which I head, is simply trying to step in, for her own good. We want to clear the title, pay her a small charitable stipend, and put her on a train back east, where she belongs. She needs a man to help her make the right decision." Gideon listened. It sounded logical, a grieving widow, a harsh frontier, a town council trying to tidy up a legal mess. Back in St. Louis, women of his class fainted when the carriage ride got too bumpy. The idea of a lone woman fighting the Kansas dirt seemed exactly as Silas described it. Delusional. Pathetic. "I'll handle the boundary lines," Silas added, his eyes gleaming behind a veil of cigar smoke. "You just focus on getting the ranch running, son. Leave the widow Wright to me." Gideon nodded slowly. He accepted the map Silas handed him, a mental map of a crazy, helpless woman. He had no reason to doubt it. Not yet. The next morning, Gideon rode out. He wanted to see the land for himself. The Hayes Ranch was vast, rolling hills of prairie grass, a sturdy barn, good cattle. But his engineer's eye caught the flaws right away. The fences were sagging in the north pasture. The windmill needed oil. The men his uncle had hired were lazy. Gideon didn't yell. He just took out his notebook and started writing. He liked fixing things. By mid-morning, he reached the western boundary. A narrow creek divided the Hayes land from the Wright property. The water ran low and clear over red stones. Gideon pulled his horse up. He sat in the saddle and looked across the water. He expected to see ruin, weeds, a dilapidated shack. Instead, he saw straight, perfect rows of winter wheat. He saw a complex, hand-made network of clay pipes drawing water from the creek, engineered with a precision that made his own chest tighten in professional appreciation. And he saw her. Josephine Wright was 50 yards away. She was swinging a pickaxe. Gideon watched her. She wasn't frail. She wasn't weeping into a handkerchief. She was working with a steady, brutal rhythm. Lift, swing, strike. The sun beat down on her, but she didn't stop. Gideon nudged his horse forward. He splashed across the shallow creek. Joe heard the water break. She stopped mid-swing. She rested the handle of the pickaxe against her boot. She didn't wipe the sweat from her forehead. She just stood there, straight as a pine board, waiting for him to approach. Gideon pulled back on the reins. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." "You're the Hayes nephew," she said. Her voice wasn't shrill, it was low, calm, cold. "Gideon Hayes, yes, ma'am." He swung down from the saddle. He wanted to be a gentleman. He wanted to help this poor, confused woman. "I was just surveying the boundary. I saw you working. That's a heavy tool for a lady." Joe didn't blink. "The dirt doesn't care if I'm a lady, Mr. Hayes. It only cares if I hit it hard enough." Gideon offered a polite, sympathetic smile. The exact smile you give a child who doesn't understand the grown-up world. "I had a long talk with Silas Thorne last night," Gideon said gently. He took a step closer. He explained your situation. I know you lost your husband. I know you're attached to this place. But you have to look at the facts. You don't have a legal deed. You're fighting a losing battle against the law and the land. Silas said the council is willing to buy you a ticket out. You should take it. Sell the claim. Let the men handle the legalities. He thought he sounded reasonable. He thought he sounded kind. Joe stared at him. The silence stretched. The wind scraped through the dry grass. When she finally spoke, her words were sharper than the pickaxe. Mr. Hayes, respect doesn't come from pitying a widow, Joe stated, her voice cutting cleanly through the open air. True respect comes from acknowledging the facts. Look around you. This soil is made of my sweat. These pipes were laid by my hands. The fact that the law refuses to recognize a woman's property doesn't make your land grab ethical. Gideon stopped. The gentle smile vanished from his face. Joe took a step forward, her eyes locked onto his. She spoke slowly, ensuring every single word carried its educational weight. You listen to me, and you listen well, Joe said clearly. When a system writes the rules so that one half of the population cannot legally own the fruit of their own labor, that isn't the law. That is legalized oppression. Equality means that my work has the exact same value as yours. You are standing on my life's work, telling me to surrender because a corrupt banker told you a fairy tale. You are an educated man. Start acting like one. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just delivered the absolute, undeniable truth. Then she turned her back on him, picked up her axe, and went back to work. Lift, swing, strike. Gideon stood there, stunned. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He didn't say another word. He couldn't. He mounted his horse and rode back across the creek. That night, Gideon sat at the small desk in his hotel room. A kerosene lamp flickered, casting long shadows against the floral wallpaper. He opened his leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with calculations, lumber costs, cattle feed, water flow rates. He turned to a blank page. He stared at it. He thought about Silas Thorne's smooth, practiced voice. She's delusional. She needs a man to help her. Then he thought about Josephine Wright. The perfect rows of wheat, the ingenious clay pipes, the absolute terrifying clarity in her eyes when she broke down the exact nature of the law. She wasn't crazy. Gideon picked up his pen. He dipped it in the inkwell. He didn't write a mathematical formula. He wrote a single sentence. Who is paying the taxes on the Wright farm? He closed the book. The map Silas Thorne had given him was wrong. And Gideon Hayes was a man who couldn't stand a bad map. He was going to find the real one. The dust motes danced in the morning light. Joe sat at her kitchen table. The house was dead quiet. She opened a small tin box. Inside were her records. They weren't grand. They weren't bound in fine leather like the ledgers at Silas Thorne's bank. They were folded slips of paper, receipts, scraps of official county stationery. She smoothed them out one by one. 1874, property tax paid in full. Signed by the county clerk. 1875, property tax paid in full. 1876, 1877. For 5 years, the town council of Oakhaven had gladly taken her money. They had taken the coins she earned by selling her surplus beans, by mending clothes, by bleeding her own fingers to the bone. They took her money to pave their streets and build their school. But when it came to her name on a deed, she didn't exist. She was a ghost who paid rent. Joe gathered the receipts. She placed them carefully back into the tin box. This was her armor. It was paper thin, but it was all she had. She tied her bonnet, picked up her empty grain sacks, and hitched her old mare to the wagon. It was Tuesday, supply day. The ride into Oakhaven took an hour. The town was bustling. Wagons rolled past. Men touched their hat brims to each other. Women gossiped on the wooden boardwalks. When Joe's wagon rattled down Main Street, the conversation stopped. Just for a second, a slight pause, a turning away of eyes. She was the town's uncomfortable secret. They used her agricultural methods to save their own crops during the drought of '75. They asked her advice on preserving meat when the salt shipments failed. But nobody stood by her. It was safer to look away. Joe parked the wagon in front of Higgins Mercantile. She walked inside. It smelled of coffee beans, leather saddles, and peppermint sticks. Mr. Higgins was behind the counter. He was a small, balding man. He usually greeted her with a nod. Today he looked down at his ledger, his face pale. "Morning, Arthur," Joe said. She placed her list on the counter. "I need 50 pounds of seed corn, 10 pounds of flour, and a spool of wire." Arthur Higgins didn't reach for the list. He kept his eyes glued to his book. He swallowed hard. "I can't, Joe." Joe went still. "Can't what?" "I can't fill the order." Arthur finally looked up. He looked miserable. "Silas came by an hour ago. He said the bank is calling in the credit lines. Anyone who extends credit to the right farm gets their own loans called in by Friday." It was a squeeze. A slow, suffocating squeeze. Silas was cutting off her oxygen. "I'm paying cash for the flour," Joe said, her voice steady. "It's not just the credit, Joe." Arthur wiped his sweating forehead with an apron. "He said if I do business with you at all, he'll ruin me. I got a wife, I got kids, I can't lose this store. I'm sorry." He pushed her list back across the counter. Joe looked at the piece of paper. Then she looked at Arthur. She didn't beg, she didn't yell. She took the list, folded it, and put it in her pocket. "You're a coward, Arthur," she said quietly. "But you aren't the one I'm angry at." She turned and walked out of the store. Her back was straight, her chin was up. But inside, something cracked. She walked past her wagon. She just kept walking, past the bank, past the saloon, past the newly built town well that she had designed. She walked until the wooden boardwalk ended and the dirt path began. She walked until she reached the iron rails of the Kansas Pacific Railway. She stopped. The steel tracks stretched out toward the horizon, shimmering in the midday heat, east to St. Louis, west to San Francisco. A low, haunting whistle echoed from miles down the line. The afternoon train was coming. Joe stared at the tracks. Her chest felt hollow. She was so tired. It was a bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. 9 years of fighting the dirt. 5 years of fighting the men who walked on it. She could just leave. She had enough cash hidden in a coffee tin at home to buy a ticket. She could pack one bag. She could get on that train. She could go somewhere where nobody knew her name, where she could just be a face in a crowd, where she didn't have to fight for the right to breathe. It would be so easy. Just let Silas win. Let them have the dirt. Let it go. The train whistle blew again. Louder this time. Joe closed her eyes. The vibration of the approaching engine hummed through the soles of her boots. No. She opened her eyes. The tracks blurred for a second, then came into sharp focus. If she left, they didn't just take her land. They took her history. They would tell the story of Oakhaven, and Josephine Wright would simply not exist. She turned around. She walked back to her wagon. Chartres. When Joe arrived back at the farm, there was a black buggy parked by her porch. Reverend Caldwell sat in her rocking chair. He was 68 years old, with a shock of white hair and a Bible resting on his knee. He was the moral compass of Oakhaven. But a compass is useless if you're too afraid to follow where it points. Joe tied off the horse. She walked up the steps. "Reverend," she said, her tone guarded. "Josephine," he offered a sad, heavy smile. "I heard what happened at the Mercantile today. Word travels fast. Bad news always does." Joe leaned against the porch rail. She didn't invite him inside. Caldwell sighed. He patted the cover of his Bible. "You are carrying a heavy burden, my child. But the Lord tests us. He asks us to be the bigger person. Silas Thorne is a hard man. But fighting him is tearing this town apart. It is tearing your soul apart." Joe stared at him. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I came out here to pray with you," Caldwell continued softly. "To ask the Lord to grant you the grace of forgiveness. If you simply let this go, If you turn the other cheek and find peace in your heart, Silas will make sure you are compensated. You can start fresh, free of anger. Jo pushed herself off the railing. The exhaustion she felt at the train tracks vanished. It was replaced by a blazing, righteous fire. She stood directly in front of the seated Reverend. "Reverend Caldwell," Jo said, her voice ringing out like a church bell, clear and unyielding, "you sit there and preach about peace while a thief picks my pocket. You listen to me. Forgiving a man who continues to trample on you isn't a virtue. It is enabling evil." The Reverend blinked, startled by her intensity. He tried to speak. "Josephine, the scripture says to love your neighbor," Jo interrupted, her words sharp and educational. "It does not say to let your neighbor enslave you. True healing doesn't begin with submission. It begins with justice. You cannot preach about the soul's peace while ignoring the body's right to survive. Compassion for your fellow man must include the absolute courage to defend their right to exist. Anything less isn't faith. It is cowardice wearing a cross." Caldwell sat frozen. His hand trembled slightly on the cover of his Bible. He had expected a weeping widow. He had found a general preparing for war. "If Silas Thorne wants my land," Jo said, turning toward her front door, "he is going to have to drag me off it in the light of day. And God help the men who stand by and watch." She opened her door, walked inside, and shut it firmly behind her. Reverend Caldwell sat alone on the porch. The wind scraped across the yard. For the first time in his life, the old preacher had absolutely nothing to say. The county clerk's office smelled like stale tobacco and rotting paper. Gideon Hayes stood at the wooden counter. It was barely 8 in the morning. The clerk, a nervous man named Miller, was already sweating. He didn't like the Hayes name. It carried too much weight in Oakhaven. "I need the tax ledgers," Gideon said. His voice was calm, flat. Miller wiped his hands on his trousers. "Mr. Hayes, those are county records. Councilman Thorne usually oversees—" "I am not asking Councilman Thorne," Gideon interrupted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I am asking you. I want to see the tax payments for the western boundary parcels, from 1873 to present." Miller swallowed hard. He went to the back room. He returned with a heavy, leather-bound book. He dropped it on the counter. Dust plumed into the air. Gideon opened the book. He traced his finger down the columns. He was an engineer. He knew how to read numbers. He knew how to spot a lie. There it was. 1874, paid. Margaret Wright? No. Josephine Wright. Paid in full. 1875, paid in full. 1876, paid. 1877, paid. Gideon stared at the black ink. Silas Thorne had looked him dead in the eye and called the land abandoned. He had claimed the widow was a squatter. He had lied, easily, flawlessly. Gideon closed the book. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," Gideon said. He turned on his heel. He walked out into the morning sun. The Kansas heat hit him, but he felt entirely cold. 2 blocks down, in the cramped office of Edmund Hale, Jo Wright sat in a straight-backed wooden chair. She wore her best dress. It was dark blue. It was mended at the cuffs. She kept her spine perfectly straight. Across the desk sat Edmund Hale, looking like a man waiting for a firing squad. And standing by the window, smoking a thin cigar, was Silas Thorne. "This is a waste of time, Edmund," Silas said. He didn't look at Jo. He looked at the smoke curling from his cigar. "The bank has already filed the paperwork. The state is processing the eviction. The widow needs to vacate." "She has a right to legal counsel, Silas," Hale muttered, adjusting his spectacles. Jo didn't look at Hale. She looked at Silas. She reached into her leather satchel. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was folded, yellowed at the edges, and brittle. She placed it on the desk. She smoothed it flat. "Read it, Edmund," Jo said. Her voice was quiet, steady. Hale leaned forward. He adjusted his glasses. His eyes scanned the ink. His breath caught in his throat. Silas turned from the window. He frowned. What is that? That is the original town charter, Joe said. Dated April 3rd, 1870. The document that founded Oakhaven. You remember it, Silas. You were in the room. Silas took a step closer. His face tightened. Joe pointed to the third line from the bottom. Read the names, Edmund, out loud. Hale cleared his throat. It sounded like dry leaves. Samuel Wright and Josephine Wright, co-founders, granted 120 acres on the western boundary. The room went dead silent. Silas stared at the paper. For a fraction of a second, the smooth, arrogant mask slipped. He looked genuinely rattled. Then the mask snapped back into place. A forgery, Silas scoffed. He waved a dismissive hand. The official charter on file at the town hall only lists Samuel. Women couldn't be granted land in 70. Everyone knows that. This is a desperate fake, Josephine. Joe stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. It is not a fake. And you know it, Joe stated, her voice carrying the cold, sharp weight of a judge's gavel. She locked eyes with Silas. Erasure is not an accident, Silas. It is a strategy. You men don't just steal the land. You steal the history so that nobody knows it was stolen in the first place. Silas narrowed his eyes, but Joe didn't let him speak. You listen to me, Joe said, her words a deliberate educational strike. Denying a person's existence on paper is the first step to denying their humanity in life. When you erase my name, you are attempting to erase my right to exist as a citizen. That isn't just fraud. That is the systematic destruction of human dignity. And I will not allow you to bury me alive. The door opened. Gideon Hayes stepped into the room. He took off his hat. He looked at Silas, he looked at Joe. He looked at the paper on the desk. Mr. Hayes, Silas said, recovering his smooth tone instantly, we were just finishing up. Mrs. Wright is having a difficult time accepting reality. Gideon looked at Silas. I was just at the clerk's office, Silas. I looked at the tax ledgers. She's paid taxes on that land for 5 years. The land isn't abandoned. Silas went very still. He looked at Gideon. The friendly, avuncular warmth vanished from the banker's eyes. It was replaced by something cold, something reptilian. Gideon, walk with me, Silas said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Gideon looked at Joe. She met his gaze. There was no plea for help in her eyes, only a quiet, demanding expectation of truth. Gideon turned and followed Silas out the door. They stood in the alley behind the lawyer's office. The sun was high. The shadows were sharp. Silas lit a fresh cigar. He tossed the match into the dirt. You're a smart boy, Gideon, an engineer. You like to see how things are built. Silas took a drag. So, let me show you how this town is built. The Hayes Ranch is the biggest operation in the county. Your Uncle Nathaniel was a visionary, but visions cost money. Gideon frowned. What are you talking about? I'm talking about debt, son, Silas said softly. Your uncle borrowed heavily to build that new barn. He borrowed to buy the northern herd. The Hayes Ranch owes my bank $8,000. The notes are due next month. Gideon felt the ground drop out from under him. 8,000. It was a fortune. I've been holding off on collecting, Silas continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Because Nathaniel was my friend. Because I wanted to give you time to settle in. But if the bank were to suddenly experience financial instability, say due to a disruptive legal battle over the western boundary, I would have to call those loans in, all of them, immediately. Gideon stared at him. You're threatening me. I am educating you, Silas corrected. You can stand up for a crazy widow. You can play the knight in shining armor, and tomorrow the bank will seize the Hayes Ranch. You will lose everything your family built, over a woman who doesn't even belong here. Think about the structure, Gideon. Think about the load-bearing walls. Don't pull the wrong brick. Silas patted Gideon on the shoulder. He walked away, leaving Gideon standing in the dust. That evening, the town meeting was held in the schoolhouse. It was packed. The air was stifling. Lantern light cast flickering shadows on the faces of the townsfolk. Jo sat in the back row. Her back was straight. She looked straight ahead. Silas Thorne stood at the front. He looked like a king holding court. "Citizens of Oak Haven," Silas boomed. "We are here to discuss the western boundary, the right parcel. The state has reviewed the case. Because the late Samuel Wright left no will, and because the land has been improperly managed by an unauthorized squatter, the state is issuing an eviction." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jo stood up. The room went quiet. I have the original charter," Jo said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I have the tax receipts. I am not a squatter. I am the owner." Silas smiled, a cruel, patronizing smile. "Mrs. Wright, we all pity you. But forged documents and misfiled tax receipts do not change the law. We need strong men running the farms on our borders, not a woman who can't let go of the past." "Liar," Jo said. "Order!" Silas slammed his hand on the desk. He looked out at the crowd. He looked directly at Gideon Hayes, who was sitting in the second row. "Mr. Hayes," Silas called out smoothly, "you are the adjoining landowner. You've seen the property. You've reviewed the situation. Does the Hayes Ranch support the council's decision to clear this abandoned land?" Every head in the room turned. Jo looked at Gideon. She remembered his face by the creek. She remembered him in the lawyer's office. He had seen the ledgers. He knew the truth. Gideon sat frozen. He felt the weight of $8,000 pressing on his chest. He saw his uncle's legacy burning to the ground. He saw Silas Thorne's cold, dead eyes. He looked at Jo. Her eyes were searching his, waiting. Gideon swallowed hard. He looked down at his boots. "The Hayes Ranch." Gideon's voice was barely a rasp. He cleared his throat. "The Hayes Ranch defers to the council's judgment." Silence. Crushing. Absolute silence. Jo didn't gasp. She didn't cry. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow right in the center of her chest. But her face remained entirely blank. She had expected the wolves to act like wolves. But she had thought just for a moment that the engineer from St. Louis might actually be a man. Jo stepped out from behind the bench. She didn't run. She walked down the center aisle. She kept her head high. She walked out the double doors of the schoolhouse and into the black Kansas night. Gideon sat in his chair. He felt sick. He felt small. He had saved his ranch, and it cost him his soul. The hammer striking the nail sounded like a gunshot. Bang, bang, bang. Jo stood on her porch. It was dawn. The air was crisp. A deputy from the county sheriff's office was nailing a piece of parchment to her front door. Notice of eviction. By order of the state land office. The deputy wouldn't look her in the eye. He hit the nail one last time, tipped his hat to the floorboards, and hurried back to his horse. Jo didn't read the paper. She didn't need to. She knew what it said. It said that 9 years of backbreaking labor meant absolutely nothing. It said that a woman's sweat dried invisible in the eyes of the law. She walked inside. She pulled a single leather suitcase from under the bed. She didn't pack much. 2 dresses, her mother's silver comb, a tintype photograph of Samuel, taken on their wedding day in Boston. She left the pots. She left the heavy winter quilts. She left the tin box with the tax receipts. They were useless now, just scraps of paper in a world built on lies. By 8 o'clock, the wagon was hitched. She drove into town. The streets were quiet. People saw her coming and stepped inside the stores. They pulled the shades. They didn't want to see the ghost being exorcised. Jo stopped the wagon in front of the Higgins house. Martha Higgins came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the suitcase in the back of the wagon, her eyes filled with tears. Mary O'Brien stepped out from behind Martha. The young girl was trembling. Jo climbed down from the wagon. She walked up to Mary. She knelt down in the dirt, bringing herself to eye level with the 14-year-old. "Mrs. Wright," Mary whispered, her voice cracking. "You can't go. They win if you go." Joe took the girl's small, rough hands in her own. "Mary, listen to me closely," Joe said. The educational weight of her words was heavy, meant to anchor the child for the rest of her life. When the law is written by men who only want to steal, the law is just a weapon. Today they have a bigger weapon. They are taking the dirt. Joe paused. She squeezed Mary's hands. "But you remember this," Joe stated clearly. "Running away from a rigged fight does not mean they win your soul. True defeat only happens when you start believing the lies they tell about you. They can take my house. They can take my fields. But they cannot take the knowledge in my head. And they cannot make me believe I am less than I am. You hold on to your mind, Mary. It is the only property no banker can ever foreclose on." Mary swallowed a sob and nodded. Joe stood up. She hugged Martha. Then she climbed back into the wagon and drove toward the train station. Miles away, Gideon Hayes was tearing his uncle's study apart. He hadn't slept. He had paced the floor of the ranch house all night. The look of quiet, absolute disappointment in Joe Wright's eyes was burning a hole through his conscience. He was looking for the banknotes. He wanted to see the debt Silas had threatened him with. He pulled out drawers. He emptied lockboxes. He found an old iron-bound trunk tucked behind a bookshelf. He pried it open. It was full of Uncle Nathaniel's personal correspondence. Gideon sifted through the letters. And then he froze. It was a letter written by Nathaniel, addressed to Silas Thorne, dated 3 years ago. Gideon read the neat, cursive handwriting. "Silas. The widow Wright has finished the irrigation pipes on the boundary. The design is brilliant. The water flow to our northern pasture has doubled. I considered offering her a payment for the engineering, but as we discussed, she is just a woman alone. Samuel is gone. She doesn't know the value of her own work, and she has no legal standing to demand a wage. We will use the water. Keep this between us." The paper trembled in Gideon's hands. He wasn't just inheriting a ranch. He was inheriting stolen honor. His uncle wasn't a visionary. His uncle was a thief. He had built the Hayes legacy by sucking the genius out of a grieving widow and then leaving her to starve. And Gideon had sat in that schoolhouse and protected that legacy. Gideon crushed the letter in his fist. He stood up. "Gideon," he whispered to the empty room, his voice raw with sudden sharp clarity. "Benefiting from a broken system is the exact same thing as breaking it yourself. Silence isn't safety. Silence is complicity." He didn't wait. He didn't think about the $8,000. He ran out the front door. He swung onto his horse, not bothering with the saddle, and kicked the animal into a dead sprint. Mac. The Kansas Pacific Railway station was loud. The steam engine hissed, a massive iron beast breathing fire and smoke. The whistle blew, a long, mournful wail that echoed off the plains. Joe stood on the wooden platform. She held her leather suitcase in both hands. The wind whipped her skirt around her ankles. She looked at the train. 9 years ago, she had stepped off a train just like this. She had been terrified, but she had been holding Samuel's hand. Now she was leaving alone. The West had chewed her up and was spitting her back out. "All aboard for Denver and San Francisco," the conductor shouted, waving a brass lantern. Passengers began to board. Joe took a deep breath. She stepped toward the iron stairs of the passenger car. She lifted her foot. "Joe!" The voice ripped through the noise of the steam and the crowd. Joe froze. Her foot hovered above the metal step. She turned her head. Gideon Hayes was running down the platform. His chest was heaving. He was covered in dust. His hat was gone. He shoved past a businessman, nearly knocking over a porter. He reached her just as the train whistle blew a second time, deafening and urgent. He didn't offer a grand, poetic apology. He didn't drop to his knees. He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was strong, desperate. He looked her dead in the eye, and he said 3 words. "Don't leave yet." Joe stared at him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I have nothing left here, Mr. Hayes. Your silence saw to that." "You have this," Gideon said. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of yellow paper. He shoved it into her hand. Joe looked down. It was a copy of a telegraph slip. To the governor of the state of Kansas. Stop. I, Gideon Hayes, owner of the Hayes Ranch, formally accuse Councilman Silas Thorne of systemic fraud, embezzlement, and the theft of the right property. Stop. I have documentary proof. Stop. Send federal investigators immediately. Stop. Joe stopped breathing. He had done it. He had put his name, his ranch, his entire legacy on the line. He had aimed a cannon at Silas Thorne and lit the fuse himself. Gideon stepped closer. The steam from the train swirled around them. Silas threatened to bankrupt my ranch if I spoke, Gideon said, his voice dropping low, for her ears only. I was a coward. I thought protecting my property was more important than protecting a human being. But I was wrong. A legacy built on the blood of an innocent woman isn't a legacy. It's a crime scene. The train jerked forward, the iron wheels ground against the tracks. "The train is leaving, lady," the conductor yelled. "Are you getting on?" Joe looked at the train. Then she looked at the telegram in her hand. Then she looked at the man standing in front of her. His boots were dusty. His eyes were quiet, steady, and entirely true. She didn't smile, but the cold, hard knot in her chest finally broke open. Joe let go of her suitcase. It hit the wooden platform with a heavy thud. She turned her back on the train. She looked at Gideon Hayes. "You're right," Joe said, her voice steady against the roar of the departing engine. "We have a war to win." The walk from the train station back to the center of town took 10 minutes. It felt like 10 years. Joe didn't look back at the train. She didn't look at the leather suitcase she had left sitting on the wooden platform. She just walked. Her boots kicked up small clouds of red dust. Gideon walked right beside her. He didn't offer his arm. She didn't ask for it. They walked like two soldiers heading to the front line. They reached the bank. Oak Haven First National. It was the only brick building on Main Street. Solid, arrogant. Gideon pushed the heavy oak doors open. They didn't knock. The bank was quiet. A lone teller looked up from his cage, his eyes widening. Silas Thorne sat behind his massive mahogany desk in the back office. The door was open. Silas was nursing a cup of coffee, looking like a man who owned the world. He looked up. He saw Joe. He saw Gideon. The smug, easy smile slipped from his face, just for a second. Then he put it right back on. "Gideon," Silas said smoothly. He didn't stand up. "I assume you're here to discuss the loan terms and Mrs. Wright. I thought you had a train to catch." Gideon didn't speak. He walked straight up to the mahogany desk. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out the yellow telegraph slip. He slapped it down on the polished wood. Hard. "Read it," Gideon said. His voice was low. It didn't shake. Silas looked at the paper. He picked it up. His eyes tracked across the inked letters. The silence in the room stretched tight. It pulled until it was ready to snap. Silas slowly set the paper back down. He leaned back in his leather chair. "You sent this to the governor, accusing me of fraud." "I did," Gideon said. "You understand what this means." Silas's voice dropped. It was no longer smooth. It was a razor. "I will call in the Hayes notes before noon. I will take your uncle's ranch. I will ruin your family name." "My family name was ruined the day my uncle stood by and let you steal from this woman," Gideon replied. He rested both hands on the edge of the desk and leaned in. "Call the notes in, Silas. Take the ranch. I don't care. I'm an engineer. I know how to build things from the ground up, but you're just a parasite, and the state investigators are going to scrape you off this town." Silas stared at him. The banker's face flushed a dark, angry purple. He looked at Joe. "You think you've won?" Silas spat. "You're a widow with no deed. The town council answers to me, the sheriff answers to me. A piece of paper in the Capitol doesn't change how things work in the dirt." Joe finally spoke. "It changes the light, Silas. And rats like you don't survive in the light." She turned around. She walked out of the office. Gideon followed her. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them. By noon, the town of Oakhaven was split in two. A telegraph operator with a loose tongue is the fastest wind in Kansas. Everybody knew. The Hayes nephew had turned on the bank. The widow was staying. The state was coming. You could see the lines drawn in the dirt. The men who owed Silas money, the men who sat on the council, they gathered at the saloon. They drank whiskey and muttered about outside interference. They talked about how a woman had no business causing this much trouble. But out on the edges of town, things were different. The farmers who had used Joe's crop rotations. The women who used her recipes to keep meat from rotting. The Irish laborers laying the tracks. They stood on their porches. They watched the main street. They didn't have money. They didn't have power. But they had numbers. And for the first time in 9 years, they had a reason to look up. It happened the next morning, right in front of the Mercantile. The air was already hot. The street was busy. Joe had come into town to buy flour. She had cash. Gideon stood on the boardwalk a few feet away, leaning against a post. He wasn't guarding her. He was just being present. A silent wait. Councilman Pickard stepped out of the barber shop. He was a loud, heavy man, a close friend of Silas. He saw Joe. He saw the crowd. He saw an opportunity to put the widow back in her place. "Well, look here," Pickard called out, his voice booming over the noise of the street. Carriages slowed down. People stopped. "If it isn't the troublemaker herself," Pickard sneered. He hooked his thumbs into his suspenders and stepped off the boardwalk. "You've caused a lot of grief for this town, Mrs. Wright, bringing the state down on us, threatening good men. And for what? You're just a housewife demanding land she can't even work properly. You have no business in men's affairs." Joe turned. She looked at Pickard. She was about to speak, but she didn't have to. The door to the Mercantile banged open. Martha Higgins marched out. Martha, who never raised her voice. Martha, who always looked at the floor when men were talking. Martha walked right down the wooden steps. Her apron was dusted with flour. Her hands were balled into fists. She walked straight up to Councilman Pickard. She was a foot shorter than him, but she didn't stop until she was right in his face. "Martha?" Pickard blinked, confused. "Go back inside. This isn't—" "You shut your mouth, Jim Pickard," Martha said. The entire street went dead silent. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Martha didn't whisper. She threw her voice out loud and clear, so that every single person on Main Street could hear it. "You stand there and call her a housewife like it's an insult," Martha yelled, her voice trembling with decades of swallowed rage. "You think this town built itself? You think the buildings just grew out of the dirt?" Picard took a step back. He looked around for help. Nobody moved. Martha pointed a flour-covered finger at his chest. The educational weight of her words landed like heavy stones, meant to shatter the lie the town had lived on. "Listen to me, and all the rest of you men," Martha declared, her voice ringing off the brick walls. "It was the women who boiled the water when the cholera hit. We were the ones who cured the sick. We kept the children from freezing to death in the winter of '75. We planted the seeds and kept the home fires burning while half of you lay drunk in the saloon." She turned, sweeping her arm to include the entire town, her eyes blazing. "The fact that you refuse to write our names in your history books does not change the truth," Martha stated explicitly. "A woman's labor is the foundation of this society. Without us, you would have nothing. Without her, half your farms would have dried up 3 summers ago. You don't own the right to erase us just because you hold the pen." Martha stood there, chest heaving. The silence was absolute. Pickard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at the crowd. He saw the faces of the other women, the farmers' wives, the laundresses. They weren't looking at the ground anymore. They were looking at him. He turned around. He walked quickly away, disappearing down an alley. Martha lowered her arm. She looked at Joe. She took a shaky breath, smoothed her apron, and nodded once. Joe nodded back. The storm hadn't just arrived. It had broken the dam. Waiting is the hardest kind of work. 3 days passed. The telegram had reached Topeka. The state governor's office had sent a wire back. An investigator was on the afternoon train. Friday. Silas Thorne was running out of time. You could see it in the way he walked. The smooth, confident stride was gone. He looked over his shoulder. He kept the bank closed on Thursday. The shades were drawn tight. Gideon knew what was happening. When a system is about to collapse, the rats start eating the paperwork. It was Thursday evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky a bruised purple. Mary O'Brien was sweeping the boardwalk outside the bank. She did it every evening for a nickel. She was small, quiet, and nobody ever paid attention to her. To the men in suits, an Irish girl with a broom was practically invisible. Mary heard the lock click. She kept sweeping. She didn't look up, but she watched from the corner of her eye. The back door of the bank opened. Silas Thorne stepped out into the alley. He was carrying a heavy iron lockbox. He looked frantic. His collar was undone. He walked toward the iron burn barrel that sat behind the mercantile. He set the box down. He opened it. Inside were ledgers, black books, the real books, the ones that showed the bribes, the forged deeds, the erased names. Silas pulled out a bottle of kerosene. He unscrewed the cap. He didn't see Mary step into the shadows of the alley. Silas turned his back to find a match in his coat pocket. In that 3-second window, Mary didn't think. She moved. She darted forward, her bare feet silent on the dirt. She reached into the open box. She grabbed the thickest black ledger on top. She clutched it to her chest and scrambled back behind a stack of empty crates, just as Silas struck a match. The flame flared. Silas tossed it into the box. The paper caught instantly. Orange light danced on the brick walls. Silas watched it burn for a minute. Then he kicked the barrel, turned, and went back into the bank. Mary didn't wait. She ran through the alley, across the street, and all the way to the edge of town, clutching the black book like it was a shield. Friday morning. The train was due at 2 o'clock. Silas Thorne realized the main ledger was missing at 9 in the morning. He didn't go to the sheriff. He couldn't. He knew exactly who had been in the alley. He had seen the broom left behind in the dirt. At 10 o'clock, Silas rode his horse down to the tracks, to Shantytown, where the Irish workers lived in canvas tents and patched wood shacks. He kicked the door of the O'Brien shack open. Sean O'Brien, Mary's father, stood up from a rickety table. He was a broad-shouldered man, but he was worn down by labor and poverty. Mary was huddled in the corner. Her mother stood in front of her, holding a cast-iron skillet. "Where is it?" Silas demanded. He didn't look like a banker anymore. He looked like a thug. He stepped into the small room. "Get out of my house," Sean said, his thick brogue rough with fear and anger. "Your little rat of a daughter stole property from my bank," Silas spat. He pulled a heavy leather riding crop from his belt. "You give me the book, O'Brien, or I'll have you thrown in the county jail for thievery. They don't let Irishmen out of there alive. Your family will starve on the tracks." Sean swallowed hard. He looked at Mary. Mary was crying, but she shook her head. She wouldn't tell him where she hid it. Silas raised the riding crop. "I'll beat it out of you myself." A hand reached through the open doorway. It clamped onto Silas's wrist like an iron vise. Silas gasped. The bone ground against bone. Gideon Hayes stepped into the shack. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely, terrifyingly calm. He twisted Silas's wrist. The riding crop dropped to the dirt floor. With his other hand, Gideon grabbed Silas by the collar of his tailored coat and hurled him backward. Silas stumbled out the door and hit the dirt outside. He scrambled to his feet, panting, looking wildly at Gideon. Jo walked up behind Gideon. She didn't look at Silas. She walked straight into the shack and knelt beside Mary. "You lay a hand on this family," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave. "And I won't bother waiting for the state investigator. I will break you in half right here." Silas wiped dust from his mouth. He sneered, trying to salvage his pride. "They're just dirty immigrants, Hayes. Thieves and ditch diggers. You're throwing away your class to protect trash." Gideon stepped off the porch. He closed the distance between them until he was inches from Silas's face. Gideon didn't shout. He spoke clearly, deliberately, delivering a lesson that left no room for interpretation. "Listen closely, Thorne," Gideon stated, his words hard and exact. "A human being, whether they sailed from Ireland with nothing in their pockets, or whether they were born in a mansion in Boston, possesses a fundamental dignity that cannot be crushed by your banknotes. A man's worth is not defined by his origin, his class, or his wealth. It is defined by his character." Gideon pointed a finger at Silas's chest. "Bullying the vulnerable doesn't make you a master of men," Gideon continued, stating the moral absolute. "It just proves that underneath your suit you are a profound coward. You have built a life on stepping on people you deemed lesser. But the truth has weight, Silas. And today, it's going to crush you." Silas stared at him. The banker's chest heaved. He had no power here. Not over the immigrant, not over the widow, and not over the engineer. Joe stepped out of the shack. Mary was standing behind her. In Mary's hands was the black ledger. She had hidden it under the floorboards. "The train whistle just blew, Silas," Joe said quietly. A long, low wail echoed across the plains. The 2 o'clock train from Topeka was pulling into the station. Silas looked at the ledger. He looked at the train smoke rising in the distance. The fight drained out of him all at once. He looked old. He looked small. He turned and walked toward the center of town. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. Gideon turned back to the O'Brien family. He tipped his hat to Sean. "Your job on the railroad is safe, Mr. O'Brien. I'll make sure of it." He looked down at Mary. He smiled. It was a real smile. "You did a brave thing today, Mary. A very brave thing." Joe put her hand on Mary's shoulder. "Keep reading your books, Mary. They make you strong." Joe and Gideon walked back toward town. The sun was high, the air was clear, the storm had passed, and the dirt was still there. But this time, the ground felt different. It felt like it belonged to the people who actually bled for it. The dust settled in Oak Haven. But the quiet felt different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a town keeping a dirty secret. It was the exhausted, hollow quiet of a town that had just been gutted in the bright light of day. Silas Thorne was gone. The state investigator had arrived on the Friday train. By Saturday morning, Silas was sitting in the back of a prison wagon heading to Topeka in irons. The bank was under state audit. The town council was suspended. The dragon was dead, but slaying a dragon doesn't rebuild a burned-down house. Joe Wright stood in her yard. It was a Tuesday. The sun was hot and unforgiving. She was looking up at her barn roof. The winter wind had torn off a section of shingles. She had patched it with canvas, but the canvas was rotting. It needed real wood. It needed a hammer and nails. She walked to the shed. She picked up her ladder. It was heavy. She didn't hear the horse until it was right at the fence line. Gideon Hayes swung down from the saddle. He tied his gelding to the post. In the back of his buckboard wagon, stacked neat and square, was a pile of fresh-cut cedar shingles. Joe leaned the ladder against the barn. She didn't walk out to meet him. Gideon opened the gate. He started carrying the bundles of shingles across the yard. He didn't say hello. He didn't wait for permission. He just walked to the base of the ladder, dropped the wood, and went back for more. Joe watched him. Her chest felt tight. It had been 4 days since the train station. 4 days since he grabbed her arm. 4 days since he put his entire life on the line to tear Silas Thorne down. She was grateful, more than grateful. He had saved her home. He had saved her life's work. But gratitude is a funny thing. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't wash away the memory of sitting in that schoolhouse, watching the man she thought she could trust stare at the floor while the wolves tore her apart. Gideon finished stacking the wood. He took off his hat. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "I brought nails, too," Gideon said. His voice was rough. "I have nails," Joe said. "Cedar needs galvanized, so they don't rust." Gideon looked up at the roof. "It's a 2-person job, Joe. The pitch is too steep for one." He didn't ask. He just started climbing the ladder. Joe didn't stop him. For the next 3 hours they worked. They didn't talk. It was a brutal, rhythmic labor. The sun baked the back of their necks. The smell of cedar resin filled the hot air. Clack, bang, bang, bang. Position the shingle, drive the nail, move over, do it again. Gideon worked with the precise, efficient movements of an engineer. He didn't waste a swing. Joe matched his pace. They moved across the roof like a machine. Pass the nails, hand over the hammer, shift the weight. By noon, their hands were blistered. Their shirts were soaked with sweat. They reached the roof's peak. The job was done. Gideon sat on the ridgeline. He let his legs dangle. He looked out over the farm, over the neat green rows of wheat, over the winding creek. Joe sat down a few feet away. She unbuttoned the top button of her collar to let the breeze in. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was heavy. It was a physical thing, sitting right there on the cedar shingles. Gideon looked at his bruised hands. "I owe you an apology," Gideon said. The wind took the words, but they were clear. Joe looked straight ahead. "You don't owe me anything, Gideon. You sent the telegram. You stopped Silas. We're square." "No, we aren't." Gideon shifted. He turned his body so he was facing her directly. He didn't look away. He didn't hide behind the brim of his hat. "I sat in that schoolhouse," Gideon said, his voice low and steady. "And I chose my property over your humanity. I let fear make a coward out of me." Joe finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark and guarded. "You did," she agreed quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. "I came out here today because I want to build something different," Gideon said. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The educational weight of his next words was deliberate, meant to bridge the gap between regret and true repair. "Joe, listen to me," Gideon stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "I recognize the utter failure of my silence. You don't have to forgive me right now. You don't have to forget that I turned my back on you. Forgiving a betrayal quickly is just a lie we tell to make things comfortable." He paused, making sure she heard every syllable. "True healing does not mean erasing the scar," Gideon told her, speaking the definition aloud so it could exist between them. "Healing means that we look right at the wound, and we decide to behave differently. It means accountability. From this day forward, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to fight a battle alone. But I will never ask you to pretend that my silence didn't hurt you. That is what real respect looks like." Joe stared at him. The wind scraped across the roof. She had braced herself for a plea. She had expected him to beg for her pardon. Men always wanted to be pardoned. They wanted the slate wiped clean so they wouldn't have to feel the guilt anymore. But Gideon wasn't asking for a clean slate. He was asking to carry the dirty one right alongside her. Joe felt the tight, hard knot in her chest loosen, just a fraction, but enough to breathe. "Water," Joe said. Gideon blinked. "Pardon?" "If we're going to build something different," Joe said. She pointed down toward the creek that divided their properties. "We need to fix the water. The spring thaw is going to flood your north pasture. Your uncle's drainage ditch is dug at the wrong angle. It's going to wash out my beans." Gideon looked down at the creek. He traced the line of the water with his eyes. The engineer in his brain woke up. "The grade is too steep on the east bank," Gideon murmured. "Exactly," Joe said. "We need to build a shared weir. Regulate the flow before it hits the bend." Gideon looked back at her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his tired, dusty face. "A weir," Gideon said. "We'll need limestone and good mortar." "I know where the limestone is," Joe said. "You know how to mix the mortar." "Yes, ma'am, I do." They climbed down from the roof. They went into the kitchen. Joe unrolled a large sheet of drafting paper on the scrubbed pine table. She set a pot of black coffee on the stove. They sat side by side. They didn't touch. But the distance between them was gone. Gideon picked up a charcoal pencil. He started sketching the creek. Joe leaned over, her shoulder brushing against his. She pointed to a spot on the paper. "Move the gate 2 yards south. The bedrock is firmer there." Gideon erased the line. He drew it again. exactly where she said. They weren't flirting, they weren't whispering sweet promises. They were doing something much more profound. They were working together. They were taking two broken separate things and finding the exact mathematics to make them whole. It was a slow burn. The best kinds always are. A fire built on green wood smokes and dies. A fire built on seasoned oak burns hot, burns quiet, and burns all through the blackest night. Gideon Hayes was seasoned oak. Joe finally knew it. Paper is a fragile thing. It burns in a barrel, it tears in the wind, it rots in the damp. But sometimes paper is the heaviest thing in the world. Sometimes paper is an anchor. 3 weeks had passed since Silas Thorne went to prison. The summer heat had broken. The mornings in Kansas were starting to carry the sharp, crisp bite of autumn. Joe hitched her mare to the wagon. She drove into town. The town of Oakhaven looked the same. The buildings were still brick and wood. The dust was still red. But the people were different. When Joe drove her wagon down Main Street, men tipped their hats. Women waved from the boardwalks. There were no hushed whispers. There were no turned backs. The ghost had flesh now. Joe stopped the wagon in front of the post office. She walked inside. The postmaster, a nervous man named Higgins, practically tripped over his own feet to hand her the mail. "Morning, Mrs. Wright," Higgins stammered. "Heavy envelope for you today, from the Federal Land Office in Washington." Joe took the thick manila envelope. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She walked back outside. She didn't open it in the street. She climbed into her wagon, drove to the edge of town, and parked near the old community well. She broke the wax seal. She pulled out the document. It was thick, high-quality parchment. The ink was black and bold. Federal Deed of Land Ownership, 120 acres. Western boundary, Oakhaven, Kansas. She moved her eyes down the page, to the line that mattered. Sole legal proprietor, Josephine Wright. Not Samuel Wright's widow, not the Wright estate. Josephine, her name. In ink, not pencil. She traced the letters with her calloused thumb. 9 years. 9 years of freezing winters, scorching summers, blistered hands, and silent tears. 9 years of being told she didn't exist. She closed her eyes. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The fight was over. She owned the dirt. But Joe knew something that the men in Washington didn't. Having your name on a piece of paper isn't enough if you're the only one who gets to hold the pen. She slid the deed back into the envelope. She flicked the reins. She drove the wagon straight to the office of Edmund Hale. Edmund Hale was sitting at his desk. He looked up when Joe walked in. "Josephine," Edmund smiled. He looked lighter these days, like a man who finally got to put down a heavy rock. "Did you get the deed?" "I got it," Joe said. She dropped the envelope on his desk. "Congratulations. It is over." "No, Edmund," Joe said. She pulled out the chair and sat down. "It's just starting. I need you to draft something for me." Edmund picked up a pen. "A will? A trust?" "A ledger," Joe said. She reached into her satchel. She pulled out a massive leather-bound book with blank, heavy pages. She set it on the desk. "The town charter was stolen because it was hidden," Joe explained. "The men in this town hid the history. I want to build a new one. I want a community record, housed here in your office, legally binding." Edmund frowned. "A record of what?" "Of everything," Joe stated. "Of the women who lay the irrigation pipes, of the Irishmen who lay the railroad tracks, of the farmers who dig the wells. If someone builds something in this town, their name goes in this book, with witnesses and signatures." Edmund stared at the blank book. "Joe, that's highly irregular. The state only tracks property and taxes." "Then Oakhaven will track its own humanity," Joe said. She tapped the leather cover. Martha Higgins walked through the door. Following right behind her was Sean O'Brien, his hands rough and stained with grease from the train tracks. Joe had sent for them both. "We are going to sign the first page today," Joe said to Edmund. You're going to write down that Martha Higgins organized the winter clothing drive of '75 that kept 10 families from freezing, and Sean O'Brien reinforced the Eastern Trestle Bridge during the flood of '76. Sean took off his cap. He looked at the book. He had never signed anything official in his life. He looked terrified and incredibly proud. "And I want you to hear this, Edmund," Jo said, turning to face the lawyer, the neighbor, and the immigrant. Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of a hardened truth. "We are doing this because history is not just a list of the men who had the most money," Jo declared, explicitly stating the moral core of her action. "History is the combined labor of every living soul in a community. When we fail to record the contributions of women, of immigrants, and of the poor, we are committing a theft of dignity. Equality doesn't exist in a vacuum. Equality only exists when there is a permanent, undeniable record that every human being here matters. We are writing our names in ink so that no banker can ever burn us away again." Edmund Hale looked at her. He set down his small pen. He reached into his drawer and pulled out his best fountain pen. He opened the book. He dipped the pen in ink. "Spell your last name for me, Mr. O'Brien," Edmund said softly. Jo watched Sean step forward. She watched Martha smile. The work wasn't just about the dirt anymore. It was about the foundation. The next morning was Monday. The Oak Haven Public School sat on a small hill at the end of Main Street. The bell rang at 8 o'clock. Jo walked up the hill. Walking beside her was Mary O'Brien. Mary was wearing a clean dress. Her red hair was braided tightly down her back. She clutched a slate and a piece of chalk to her chest. She was shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. They reached the front steps of the school. The schoolmaster, a stern man named Mr. Finch, stood in the doorway. He watched them approach. He crossed his arms. "Mrs. Wright," Finch said stiffly. He looked down his nose at Mary. "I was not informed you were bringing a guest." "She isn't a guest, Mr. Finch," Jo said. "She is a student. Her family pays town taxes. She is legally entitled to a seat in that classroom." Finch sighed. "Mrs. Wright, be reasonable. The Irish children don't fit in here. The other parents will object. It disrupts the order of things. She would be much happier staying at home." Mary took a step backward, hiding behind Jo's skirt. Jo didn't yell, she didn't threaten. She simply turned around and knelt down in the dirt, bringing herself eye to eye with the terrified young girl. Jo placed her hands on Mary's shoulders. "Look at me, Mary," Jo said. Mary looked up, her blue eyes wide. "Listen to me carefully," Jo stated, her voice carrying clearly, so that Mr. Finch and the children watching from the windows could hear every word. "Systemic change does not happen because people suddenly become generous," Jo taught her, making the brutal, necessary truth explicit. "It happens because people like you force the system to acknowledge your existence. You walking into that school is not a favor they are granting you. It is your fundamental human right. You do not shrink yourself to make them comfortable. You take up space, Mary. You make them see you, because the only way to destroy prejudice is to walk right through the front door and prove that your mind is just as brilliant as theirs." Jo stood up. She took Mary's hand. She looked at Mr. Finch. The schoolmaster's face was pale. He uncrossed his arms. He stepped to the side, leaving the doorway open. Jo gave Mary's hand one last squeeze. "Go," Jo whispered. Mary took a deep breath. She lifted her chin. She walked past the schoolmaster. She walked into the classroom. She took a seat in the front row. Jo stood in the schoolyard. She listened to the sound of the wooden desk scraping against the floorboards. She listened to the murmur of children. The barrier was broken. That evening, the Kansas sky burned gold and crimson. Jo stood on her porch. The air smelled of wood smoke and dry grass. The deed to her farm was locked safely in her tin box. She heard boots on the wooden steps. Gideon Hayes walked up. He wasn't carrying tools today. He was just a man standing on a porch at the end of the day. He leaned against the railing beside her. He looked out over the fields. "The weir is holding," Gideon said quietly. "Water flow is perfectly even." "I know," Jo said. "I checked it at noon." They stood in silence. The crickets began to sing in the tall grass. "You did a lot of heavy lifting today," Gideon murmured, looking at her. "The community record. The school." "I was just planting seeds, Gideon," Joe said. She looked at him. His quiet eyes. His dusty boots. He didn't reach for her. He just stayed exactly where he was, beside her, equals in the fading light. "It's a good place to plant them," Gideon said softly. Joe looked back out at her 120 acres. She had left her old life on a train to run toward freedom. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, she realized she finally knew the truth. Real freedom wasn't leaving. Real freedom was staying, fighting, and making the ground under your feet big enough for everyone to stand on. October came to Oakhaven with a cold bite. The wind changed direction. It stopped blowing dust and started carrying the smell of frost. The prairie grass turned a pale, brittle gold. The harvest was done. The silos were full. The town had settled into a quiet, uneasy peace. Joe Wright was down by the creek. She was clearing out dead brush before the first freeze. Her breath plumed in the cold air. Her hands were wrapped in thick leather gloves. She heard a horse approach. She didn't look up right away. She knew the sound of that horse. She knew the heavy, measured tread of the man riding it. Gideon Hayes stepped down from his saddle. He walked to the edge of the creek. He didn't pick up a branch to help. He just stood there. He looked tired. Not the good physical tired that comes from swinging a hammer. This was a heavy, quiet kind of tired, the kind that sits behind the eyes. Joe stopped pulling brush. She stood up. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "Something's wrong," Joe said. Gideon reached inside his heavy wool coat. He pulled out an envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. It was stamped with a return address from St. Louis. He held it out to her. Joe took off her right glove. She took the envelope. She opened it and pulled out the letter inside. The handwriting was sharp and professional. She read it once, then twice. It was an offer, a massive one. The largest engineering firm in Missouri wanted Gideon back. They were offering him a full partnership. They wanted him to design a new suspension bridge across the Mississippi River. It was the kind of job an engineer dreamed about his entire life. It meant wealth. It meant a name in the big city. It meant leaving the dirt and the wind of Kansas behind forever. Joe carefully folded the letter. She slid it back into the envelope. She handed it back to him. Her face was perfectly still. "It is a very good offer," Joe said. Her voice was steady. It didn't waver. "It's everything I spent 20 years working for," Gideon said quietly. He looked at the envelope in his hands. Then he looked at her. "They want an answer by the end of the month. They sent a train ticket with the letter." The silence stretched out between them. The creek bubbled over the red rocks. Gideon was waiting. He was waiting for her to ask him to stay. He was waiting for her to tell him that she needed him, that the farm needed him, that the town was still too fragile. Joe knew that. She could see it in the tight set of his jaw. But she didn't say it. Instead, Joe took a step forward. She looked him dead in the eye. "Gideon, listen to me closely," Joe said. Her voice was firm. The educational weight of her words was deliberate. She was laying down a truth she had paid for with 9 years of her life. "A relationship built on obligation is just another cage," Joe stated, speaking the words with absolute clarity. "I did not fight this hard for my own freedom just to turn around and take yours away. You have to choose your own life. If you stay here because you pity me, or because you feel you owe me something after Silas Thorne, you will eventually resent me, and I will not be a burden to any man." She paused, making sure he heard every single syllable. "Love does not trap a person," Joe continued, her tone unwavering. "Love holds the door wide open and lets them decide. If you want to build bridges in St. Louis, you get on that train. I will shake your hand. I will thank you for being a good neighbor, and I will mean it. But you do not stay for me unless staying is the exact life you want for yourself." Gideon stared at her. The cold wind whipped between them. She wasn't begging, she wasn't crying, she was offering him the most terrifying thing in the world: absolute, unconditional free will. He looked at the letter. Then he looked back at her. "I have to think," Gideon said. His voice was thick. "I know," Joe said. "Take all the time you need." She turned around. She went back to clearing the dead brush. She didn't look back to watch him ride away. Gideon sat in his uncle's study. The kerosene lamp cast a warm yellow glow over the heavy oak desk. It was past midnight. The ranch was dead quiet. The letter from St. Louis sat in the center of the desk. Beside it sat the train ticket. First class. He picked up the ticket. He ran his thumb over the stiff paper. He closed his eyes. He pictured St. Louis. He saw the paved streets. He heard the clatter of fine carriages. He imagined the sprawling drafting rooms, the smell of fresh ink, the men in tailored suits discussing tensile strength and iron rivets. It was clean, it was ordered, it made sense. Then he opened his eyes. He looked out the window. It was pitch black. But he knew what was out there. He knew the exact dip of the rolling hills. He knew the smell of the cedar shingles he had nailed to a barn roof. He knew the precise, perfect flow of the water running through the weir he had built with his own 2 hands. With her hands. He thought about Josephine Wright. He thought about the way she swung a pickaxe, the way she stared down a corrupt town council without blinking, the way she had looked at him this afternoon by the creek. She had offered him the door. She hadn't tried to tie him down. Gideon looked at the letter again. He didn't want to build a bridge across the Mississippi. He wanted to build a life. Gideon picked up the letter from the engineering firm. He tore it in half. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He tore it again. He walked over to the cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the room. He opened the iron door. The embers were glowing orange. He tossed the pieces of paper inside. He watched them catch fire. He watched them turn to ash. Then he picked up the train ticket. He dropped that in, too. He didn't feel a sense of sacrifice. He didn't feel like a martyr giving up his dreams. He felt entirely, wonderfully awake. The next morning, the sun was bright and sharp. Jo was in the kitchen washing her coffee cup. She heard heavy boots on the front porch. She didn't reach for her rifle anymore. She knew the footsteps. She opened the door. Gideon stood there. He was wearing his best suit, not his work clothes. His dark wool suit, a clean white shirt, and a string tie. His boots were polished. He had shaved. Jo looked at him. Her heart gave a sudden hard kick against her ribs, but her face remained calm. "You're dressed for a train ride," Jo said quietly. "No," Gideon said. "I'm dressed to go into town. Put your coat on, Jo. We have business at the lawyer's office." Jo frowned. "Edmund's office? Why?" "Just get your coat." He didn't explain. Jo didn't ask again. She went inside, grabbed her heavy wool coat, and walked out to his waiting buckboard wagon. They rode into Oakhaven in silence. The town was busy with the morning trade. People watched them pass. A month ago, they would have glared. Today, they nodded respectfully. Gideon parked the wagon in front of Edmund Hale's office. He stepped down and offered Jo his hand. She took it. His grip was warm and firm. They walked inside. Edmund Hale was sitting at his desk, surrounded by stacks of legal books. He looked up, surprised. "Gideon, Josephine, I wasn't expecting you." Edmund pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Is there a problem with the deed?" "No problem, Edmund," Gideon said. He reached inside his suit coat. He didn't pull out a velvet ring box. He didn't pull out a bouquet of flowers. He pulled out a folded legal document. It was 3 pages long, written in his own precise architectural handwriting. He placed it on the desk, right in front of Jo. "Read it," Gideon said. Jo looked at him. Then she looked down at the paper. She read the first line. "Articles of Agreement and Permanent Merger of Water and Land Resources." She kept reading. It wasn't a marriage license. It was a contract. A legally binding agreement to permanently merge the Hayes Ranch and the Wright Farm into a single, unified operating entity. It outlined the shared use of the creek, the shared profits of the harvest, the shared liabilities. And at the bottom of the last page, there were 2 blank lines for signatures, underneath the first line. Gideon Hayes, co-proprietor. Underneath the second line, Josephine Wright, co-proprietor. They were on the exact same level, the exact same size. Jo's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the words. Edmund Hale leaned over and read the document. He let out a low whistle. "Gideon," Edmund said softly, "this is highly unusual. This contract supersedes the individual deeds. It makes you entirely responsible for her debts, and her entirely responsible for yours. It makes you absolute equals in the eyes of the law regarding this property." "I know exactly what it does," Gideon said. Jo looked up from the paper. She looked at Gideon. Her eyes were bright, fierce. "You didn't go to St. Louis," Jo whispered. "I didn't go to St. Louis," Gideon confirmed. He turned to face her fully. He didn't drop to one knee. He stood tall, looking her right in the eye. "Jo, I need you to hear this. And I need Edmund to witness it," Gideon said. His voice was steady, ringing with an undeniable truth. The educational weight of his words filled the small office, meant to shatter the old ways of the world. "The world tells men that to be a man, we have to rescue a woman," Gideon stated clearly. "We are taught that love means putting a woman behind us for safekeeping and making all the decisions for her. That is a lie. True partnership is not about ownership, and it is not about protection." He reached out and tapped the contract on the desk. "True partnership is about standing shoulder to shoulder with an absolute equal," Gideon declared, his voice hard with conviction. "I am not signing this paper to take care of you. I am signing this because you are the strongest, most brilliant person I have ever known, and I want the profound privilege of working beside you. Equality is not a favor I am doing for you. Equality is the only soil where real, lasting love can actually grow." He looked at her. "I don't want a wife to sit in a parlor," Gideon said quietly. "I want a partner. I want you." Jo stared at him. The last 9 years of her life flashed behind her eyes. The erasure, the silence, the fighting for every single inch of ground. And now, a man was standing in front of her, handing her a pen, asking her to build an empire not as his subordinate but as his equal. Jo didn't cry. She smiled. It was a slow, beautiful, devastating smile. "You're a stubborn man, Gideon Hayes," Jo said. "I'm an engineer," Gideon replied. "I like things built to last." Jo picked up the pen from Edmund's desk. She dipped it in the inkwell. She signed her name on the bottom line, bold, clear, unapologetic. She handed the pen to Gideon. He signed his name right beside hers. Edmund Hale took the document, stamped it with his notary seal, and signed as the witness. "It's done," Edmund said softly. "It's ironclad." Gideon took the copy of the contract. He folded it and handed it to Jo. She put it in the pocket of her heavy wool coat. They walked out of the lawyer's office. The sun was high now. The air was cold, but the sky was a brilliant, piercing blue. They walked down the wooden boardwalk of Main Street, together. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. Their shoulders brushed as they walked in perfect step. They reached the end of the street. They stopped in front of the community well. The same well where, months ago, Jo had stood in the third row, watching her name be erased from history. The brass plaque was still there. The names of the 9 men were still etched into the metal. But it didn't matter anymore. Everyone in Oakhaven knew the truth. And the truth was locked in a leather book in Edmund Hale's office, signed and witnessed. A long, low whistle echoed across the prairie. The 2 o'clock train to Denver was pulling into the station on the edge of town. White steam billowed into the blue sky. Jo listened to the sound. She remembered the sheer terror of stepping onto that platform. She remembered the heavy weight of her leather suitcase. She didn't look toward the tracks. She looked at the well she had designed. Gideon stood right beside her. He looked at the well, too. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He knew. He reached out. He took her hand. His skin was rough with calluses. Her skin was rough with calluses. It wasn't a soft touch. It was a solid one. It felt like coming home. Joe squeezed his hand back. The train whistle blew one last time and then faded away into the vast Kansas wind. They weren't going anywhere. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
Out here on the frontier, people like to believe that victory is loud, that it comes with gunfire, with men standing tall in the dust, with someone riding off into the sunset as the hero. But the truth is quieter than that. Sometimes, victory is a woman choosing not to board a train. Sometimes, it is a name written back into a history that tried to erase it. And sometimes, it is a town finally forced to look at itself in the light and decide what kind of people it wants to be. What we witnessed in this story is not just a fight for land, it is a fight for dignity, for recognition, and for the simple, undeniable truth that every human being has the right to exist, to be seen, and to be valued. Josephine Wright did not win because she was the strongest in the room, or because the system suddenly became fair. She won because she refused to disappear. She understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding, that injustice survives not only through power, but through silence, through fear, and through the quiet acceptance of those who choose comfort over truth. Gideon's journey reminds us of another hard lesson, the cost of silence. He was not a villain, not at first. He was something far more familiar. He was a good man who chose the easy path when it mattered most. And that is where real change begins, not in perfection, but in accountability. The moment he chose to stand up, to risk everything, to admit he was wrong, that was the moment the story shifted. Because courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision that something else matters more. And then there is the town itself. Oak Haven represents something we still see in every corner of the world, a system that benefits from invisible labor while refusing to acknowledge it. Women, immigrants, the overlooked, they build, they sustain, they sacrifice. Yet their names are often the first to be forgotten. This story forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth. It teaches us that equality is not just about fairness in the present. It is about preserving truth in the record, making sure that no contribution is erased simply because it was inconvenient to acknowledge. The deeper meaning of this story is this: true ownership is not about what the law says, but about what you are willing to stand for. True justice is not handed down. It is demanded, defended, and built piece by piece by those who refuse to accept less. And true freedom is not running away from a broken system. It is staying, fighting, and reshaping it so that others won't have to endure the same fight alone. In the end, this wasn't just Josephine's story. It belongs to anyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they don't belong. It belongs to those who kept going anyway. And maybe that's why it stays with us. Because somewhere, in one way or another, we've all stood on that platform, deciding whether to leave or to turn back and fight. And if there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: your voice matters, your work matters, and your existence is never something that needs permission to be real.